not metaphorically, not in the way that grief sometimes manifested as phantom sensations in the lonely hours before dawn. Actual crimson, thick as arterial spray, pooled beneath the glass each morning. Though her hands were always clean, her wrists unmarked, her reflection unchanged except for the haunted hollow of her eyes, she told no one. In the weeks since inheriting her grandmother's Victorian manor on the Yorkshire moors, Evangeline had learned that some phenomena demanded silence. The locals already whispered about the Ashworth estate, muttering about the old bloodline, the family curse, the way successive generations had retreated into its shadowed corridors, until they simply disappeared into the walls like water into thirsty stone. Her grandmother had been the last of them. Margot Ashworth, dead for 3 months now, had willed the entire manor to a granddaughter she'd never met, never acknowledged, though Evangeline's mother had spent a lifetime nursing a bitterness about that rejection. The house had been sealed for decades. The solicitors had required a week simply to find someone brave enough to turn the key. Now it was hers. 17 rooms of rotting velvet, stained glass windows that fractured moonlight into crimson shards, and a darkness that seemed to breathe. The bleeding mirror was only the beginning. The dreams had started 3 weeks before the inheritance letter arrived, before she even knew her grandmother was dead. In them, she walked through corridors she'd never seen, barefoot on marble cold enough to sting, pursuing a silhouette that moved just beyond the reach of candlelight. He never turned, never spoke, but she felt the weight of his attention like a hand at her throat, and when she woke, her sheets were drenched in perspiration that smelled of iron and old stone. "Find me," a voice that wasn't quite sound had whispered through the darkness. "Find me before the blood remembers what we've forgotten." Evangeline had been a hospice worker in London, steady, practical, armored against sentiment before the solicitor's letter changed everything. She'd held the hands of the dying, listened to their final confessions, learned that death rarely came as the mercy it promised. Grief had taught her skepticism. The supernatural was a luxury of people with time for delusion, and yet, the mirror demanded explanation. She stood before it now, in the deep gray of pre-dawn, watching as fresh crimson pooled at its base like something weeping behind glass. Her reflection stared back, too pale, too thin, dark hair disheveled from another night of fractured dreams. Behind her reflection, the manor bedroom existed in shades of charcoal and ash, the 4-poster bed draped in moth-eaten damask, the wardrobe doors hanging open like mouths mid-scream, the single window revealing nothing but more darkness beyond. And then for just a moment she saw something else, a figure behind her. Tall, angular, impossibly beautiful in the way that predators are beautiful. Medieval features refined by centuries into something almost architectural, eyes that held the color of old blood, catching what little light existed and transforming it into something that burned. Evangeline spun around. The bedroom was empty, but the air still carried the ghost of him, bergamot and vetiver, and underneath that, something mineral and ancient, the scent of deep places that hadn't felt sunlight since the world was younger. She pressed her palms against her thighs, breathing through the accelerated thump of her heart. Exhaustion, she told herself. Grief and stress and the isolation of this godforsaken place. But she knew better. The dreams had been teaching her the truth all along, stitching together knowledge in the language of the subconscious. She understood things now that she hadn't learned consciously: the layout of the manor's east wing, the weight of a particular silver locket, the specific shade of candlelight that made his eyes look almost human. She understood the history of the Ashworth bloodline. Blood witches, the old whispers said, practitioners of the darker arts. Families who made bargains with things that wore aristocratic masks and moved through darkness as if born to it. Her hand trembled as she reached for the mirror. The glass was warm. That wasn't possible. Nothing in this manor was ever warm, yet the surface radiated heat like a living thing. When she touched it, the crimson beneath the glass surged, a wave of scarlet that made her gasp and pull away. And in that moment of contact, a single image flooded her mind. A cathedral, but desecrated. Stone walls wept something darker than water. A man knelt before an altar, and his hands were shaking, and the white robes he wore were stained with black that looked almost like wings. Something approached from the shadows, and though she couldn't see its face, she felt the vast weight of its judgment. "Choose," it said in a voice like a door closing on paradise. "Ascension or annihilation, heaven or hunger, there is no middle way." And he, beautiful, anguished, centuries trapped in a single moment of impossible choice, had turned his face toward damnation and said, "I choose her." Evangeline gasped back to herself, hand burning where it had touched the glass. The mirror had returned to normal, reflecting only morning gray and her own shaken expression. The blood was gone. It was always gone by day, leaving her to wonder if she was unraveling. If the stress of this inheritance was fracturing her already fragile sanity. But under her fingernails, she found traces of something dark that smelled of iron and roses. She moved through the manor that day with new purpose, pulling dust covers from furniture and opening windows despite the cold that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The house resisted, the shutters stuck, the windows groaned, and more than once she felt the distinct sensation of being watched by something vast and patient and hungry. The library was on the second floor, a room so vast it seemed to contain its own weather. Floor-to-ceiling shelves held leather-bound volumes whose spines had faded to illegibility. Evangeline selected one at random. It seemed important to choose blindly, to trust something other than logic. The book fell open to a page marked with a ribbon of black silk. On the covenant of blood and soul, the chapter heading read, in script so ornate it resembled ceremony. How the damned may bind themselves to the living, and what price such binding demands. Her hands shook as she read. When one cursed with immortality encounters a soul whose bloodline carries the old magic the witch touched, the blessed, the descendant of those who made bargains with forces anterior to God, a resonance occurs. Dreams become shared, mirrors become windows, the veil thins. The damned one recognizes in the living soul the possibility of redemption, or at least, the possibility of being known by something that sees past the monstrosity to whatever humanity remains. And the living soul, if she is brave enough, or fool enough, or desperate enough, may choose to cross that threshold. She may offer her blood, she may bind herself to the eternal night, but such binding comes with a price that transcends death. Evangeline read those words as the afternoon light slanted through the library windows, turning the dust motes to something that looked like falling ash. The book trembled in her hands. In its margins, in handwriting that flickered between elegance and anguish, were notes in a language she couldn't identify but understood, somehow, with the deep comprehension granted only by blood memory. He's been waiting, those notes seemed to whisper, for someone like you, for centuries. In dreams and mirrors and the spaces between heartbeats, he's been calling, and you've answered. That night, when the bleeding began again, Evangeline didn't turn away from the mirror. She waited for him to coalesce behind her reflection, that beautiful, tormented silhouette. She waited for the voice that lived in her blood to speak its terrible truth. And when she finally saw him fully for the first time, his eyes meeting hers with the weight of centuries of loneliness, she understood that her inheritance had never been the manor. It was him, and the choice before her would demand everything she was willing to become. The dreams intensified after that first mirror contact. Each night, Evangeline descended into scenes drenched in gothic sorrow-stone corridors, where candlelight couldn't quite penetrate the shadows, ballrooms where figures danced in clothes from centuries past, gardens overgrown with moonflowers that bloomed only in darkness, and always, she felt him at the periphery of these visions, moving just beyond her reach. But now, for the first time, he allowed her to see fragments of his face, the sharp line of a jaw, eyes the color of storm clouds shot through with amber light, hands scarred by something ancient and terrible, holding them always at his sides as if restraining them from touching her. When he moved, there was a terrible grace to it, the economy of motion of something that had learned to exist in shadow long before becoming a creature of it. On the fourth night, she heard him speak her name, Evangeline. It wasn't a sound. It was a knowledge that bypassed her ears entirely and resonated directly in her chest cavity, a vibration that made her ribs feel like a cage barely containing something larger than her own heart. She sat upright in the manor bed, gasping, her nightgown plastered to her skin with perspiration. The moonlight through the window had taken on a peculiar quality, silvered, almost liquid, as if the light itself had become blood. She could taste copper on her tongue, and there, in the corner where shadow always pooled deepest, she saw him, not a reflection, not a dream, a presence that displaced air, that made the temperature plummet, until her breath formed visible clouds. He stood motionless, deliberately so, she realized with a start, as if any sudden movement might shatter her fragile acceptance of what he was. "You can see me," he said, and his voice carried harmonics that suggested it came from somewhere very far away. "Truly see me. This is unexpected. Most of the bloodline have lost the capacity across generations." Evangeline's throat constricted. She should have been terrified. Every practical instinct screamed at her to flee this manor and its impossible inheritances, to return to the rational world of hospice care and linear time. Instead, She found herself sliding back against the headboard, pulling her knees up, studying him with the same clinical attention she'd once given dying patients. Except this creature was the opposite of death. This creature was the refusal of death, stretched across centuries until it had become something else entirely. "The mirror," she said. Her voice sounded strange, distant, as if belonging to someone else. "The blood in the mirror, that's been you?" A sound emerged from him that might have been laughter or agony. It was difficult to tell the difference. "I have been trying to reach you since the moment your grandmother died. The manor knew. It recognized your bloodline the instant you crossed the threshold. And the blood, yes. That was my attempt at communication. A vulgar gesture, I realize now. But I have been alone here for rather longer than is conducive to sophistication." He moved then slowly, deliberately, like someone approaching a startled animal. Each step brought him nearer to the pool of moonlight, and Evangeline found herself holding her breath, waiting for the illumination to reveal fangs, to confirm the monster beneath the aristocratic beauty. Instead, what the light unveiled was something far more terrible: anguish. It was written in the geometry of his face, in the way his shoulders curved inward, as if perpetually bracing for a blow that never quite landed. It lived in his eyes, in that storm cloud gray touched with amber that seemed to burn with an ancient sorrow. "How long?" she asked quietly. "Have I been here? Or have I been aware that you were coming?" "Both." He stopped his approach a few feet from the bed, a conscious choice, she realized, to maintain distance, to maintain her sense of safety and agency. The gesture was more intimate than physical touch could have been. "This manor has been my tomb since 1642, he said, and his accent shifted as he spoke, becoming older, more archaic. "The year of my damnation. The year I refused the path that was offered to me, and in that refusal, became this." He looked down at his scarred hands with something approaching disgust. "But the knowing of you, that began in dreams some 3 months past. Your grandmother, Margot, she understood what you are. She left you the manor deliberately. She left me to you deliberately. It was the final gift of a woman who understood that some debts can only be paid across generations." Evangeline's mind stuttered. "My grandmother knew about you? She was bound to me as well, once. Not in passion, she was already an old woman when we made the blood covenant, and her gift was different from yours. She offered me knowledge, memory, a way to survive the isolation by maintaining connection to the world beyond these walls. In exchange, I offered her the secrets of the bloodline, the true history of what the Ashworth women are." He moved closer still, now near enough that she could feel the cold radiating from him, not the absence of warmth, but something more active, a kind of inverse heat that made her skin prickle. "What we are," Evangeline said slowly, not a question. "Witches, priestesses of an older faith. Your bloodline made a covenant with entities that walked this earth before Christianity claimed its dominance. That covenant grants you the capacity to see through the darkness, to perceive what others cannot, to touch things that burn mortal hands because you carry ancient protections in your very cells." He paused, studying her face in the moonlight. "And it grants me the capacity to recognize in you the possibility of—" He trailed off, and when he continued, his voice had dropped to something barely audible. "Redemption." Evangeline's breath caught. Redemption from what? From centuries of hunger, of isolation, of being a thing that exists between states, not alive, not dead, not human, but unable to become fully monster either. His eyes met hers, and in them she saw the depths of what he'd endured centuries scrolling past like a film reel of unending darkness. "I was a priest once, a man of faith. When I was turned, I believed it was punishment for some hidden sin. I believed myself damned, and so I became damned. In every way that mattered." He reached out, and his scarred fingers stopped just short of touching her face, close enough that she felt the cold radiating from his skin. "But you are different. You come to me in dreams not because I forced myself upon them, but because your bloodline calls to mine across the centuries. Your grandmother understood this. She knew that her blood would thin in the generations after her, but that your blood would sing with the old magic, and she knew that He pulled his hand back, let it fall to his side. "I might find in you something worth becoming human for again." The vulnerability in those words shattered something in Evangeline's chest. She found herself reaching toward him instead, her trembling fingers moving through the space he'd deliberately maintained. She did not touch him. Not yet, but neither did she pull away. "Tell me your name," she whispered. "Not the title, not the role you've played in this manor for centuries. Your real name, the one from before." For a long moment, he was silent. The moment stretched like pulled taffy, like the pause before dawn. The shadows around him seemed to deepen, as if the manor itself was holding its breath. "Lysander," he finally said, and the word carried the weight of centuries of secrecy. "I was christened Lysander, son of Edmund, heir to lands that no longer exist in any map, and I have been waiting for you since before you were born. Though I didn't know it then, the blood knew, the manor knew, the darkness knew. Lysander." The name fitted itself into her like a key turning in a lock she'd always carried. Evangeline understood, in that moment, that she was standing on the precipice of something that would irrevocably alter the architecture of her existence. She could step back, could close her eyes, wake herself into rational denial, pack her belongings and return to London and a life of deliberate ignorance. Or she could reach forward, could touch the cold that radiated from the vampire priest, who'd been waiting centuries for someone like her. She reached forward. Her fingertips met his scarred palm, and the contact burned not with heat, but with a sensation that bypassed nerve endings entirely and resonated in the deep places of her being. The manor seemed to tremble around them. Candlelight that hadn't been there a moment before bloomed in every corner of the bedroom, and the shadows recoiled as if wounded. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the circle of light, Evangeline heard something that might have been the manor itself, singing a song in a language older than prayer. The first morning, after their touch, Evangeline could not locate Lysander anywhere in the manor. She searched the east wing where the library lived, the crypt beneath the chapel, the Victorian conservatory where roses bloomed despite the absence of sunlight. In each room, she found traces of him, the specific cold that marked his presence, the scent of bergamot and old stone. Once a chair positioned as if someone had been sitting in contemplation of the rain through a window, but not him. The sun had risen full and golden across the moors. The daylight was thorough and unforgiving, and Evangeline realized with a jolt of panic that Lysander existed in the inverse of this. Where she walked now, he could not follow. Not until night reclaimed the sky. She spent the day restless, moving through the manor like a ghost herself, unable to settle into any of the tasks she'd begun, the cataloging of her grandmother's possessions, the reading of the journals that detailed family history, the practical work of inheritance. Instead, she found herself drifting toward windows, watching the sun's trajectory with the intensity of someone awaiting execution. It was in the afternoon, while shelving books in the library, that she discovered the journal. It was bound in leather the color of dried blood, with no name on the spine. When she opened it, she found her grandmother's handwriting precise, elegant, the product of a classical education filling the pages in careful paragraphs. The date on the first entry was 1943. "I have seen him tonight. Truly seen him, not merely felt his presence in the darkness. He is more beautiful than terror should allow, more terrible than beauty can justify. The manor brought me to the East Tower at midnight, though I have no memory of climbing the stairs. I found him there, sitting before a mirror in candlelight, staring at his own reflection, as if he no longer recognized it. When I spoke, he did not turn, but I felt him become aware of me, in the way that a trapped creature becomes aware of a potential escape. This is madness. This house is madness. And yet I think I will return tomorrow night." Evangeline's hands trembled as she read. Entry after entry detailed an impossible relationship, the slow building of trust between woman and vampire, the exchange of blood that she skipped over with her eyes averted, the intellectual companionship that had sustained Lysander through decades of isolation and sustained her grandmother through a marriage that sounded loveless and cold. But it was the final entry, dated in handwriting that had become tremulous with age, that made Evangeline's breath catch. "He has asked me to leave the manor to someone from the bloodline, someone who might complete what he and I could never be. I am old now, and while the blood covenant has extended my life beyond natural measure, I feel the approach of true death. I cannot offer him forever, but I can offer him hope. I can ensure that the next woman of our bloodline will inherit not just walls and shadows, but the possibility of transcendence, of becoming, together, something neither damned nor entirely human. My granddaughter, Evangeline, child of my estranged daughter, whom I have never met, carries the ancient blood. The manor will know her. And if she is brave enough to accept what Lysander is, and what he might become through her, then perhaps this family's curse can finally become a blessing." The journal fell from Evangeline's numb fingers, landing open on the library floor. Her grandmother had known, had orchestrated this, had spent decades bound to a vampire through blood and covenant, not from passion, but from deliberate intention to gift her an impossible love. The sun was setting, The light that poured through the library windows was turning amber, then rose, then something deeper. Evangeline felt the manor shift around her, felt it wake in the way that it hadn't during the day. The shadows deepened, the temperature plummeted, and somewhere in the darkness that was claiming the manor's corridors, she heard movement. Lysander emerged from the shadows of the grand staircase, like he was being born from them. He was different in the half-light of dusk. The careful composure he'd maintained the distance, the restraint had given way to something raw. His eyes burned with the amber at their centers, and when he saw her, there was such hunger in that gaze that Evangeline's breath caught. "You found the journal," he said. "It wasn't a question. You knew she would leave me the manor. That's why you've been waiting here. Not just centuries, but specifically for me. For someone with enough of the bloodline to..." She couldn't quite articulate it. Couldn't name the thing that was building between them. "To bind to," Lysander finished softly. "Yes. Your grandmother understood what I did not. That isolation had transformed me into something less than what I was. That hunger, untempered by connection, becomes a kind of death in itself. She offered me what she could, but her blood was already thinning with age. The covenant between us sustained me, but it could not transform me, could not make me believe that redemption was still possible for something that had walked in darkness as long as I have." He descended the library stairs slowly, and with each step, Evangeline felt the space between them become charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. "But you," he continued, "you carry the old blood undiluted. You dream my dreams. You see what others cannot. When you touched my hand this morning, I felt for the first time in 300 years the possibility of becoming something other than monster." "My grandmother loved you," Evangeline said. It was both revelation and accusation. "She did, in her way. She was a remarkable woman, your grandmother, and she showed me more kindness than I deserved. But it was not the love that breaks the centuries. That requires something more primal, something that burns rather than comforts." He stopped a few feet before her, and the hunger in his expression had transformed into something equally dangerous, but different vulnerability. "Your grandmother prepared you for this without your knowing. She filled your blood with the knowledge of what I am. She made sure the manor would call to you in dreams, would show you the possibility before you had to face the reality." The library had grown almost completely dark now, and in that darkness, Lysander seemed to shimmer at the edges, as if he were being constructed from shadow itself. "There is a room," he said quietly, "that your grandmother used to visit with me. A ballroom that exists beneath the eastern foundation of this house. It is where the blood covenant was first made, where the magic sleeps when the sun is high. I wonder..." He extended his hand, scarred and careful. "I wonder if you would like to see it, to understand what binds this manor, and what might bind us, should you choose." Evangeline looked at his outstretched hand. She thought of the bleeding mirror, of the dreams that had stitched him into her unconscious mind long before her rational awareness could catch up. She thought of her grandmother, spending decades with this creature, not from enchantment, but from genuine connection, from the recognition that loneliness in its purest form could transcend species and mortality. She took his hand. The cold of his skin was shocking, but not unpleasant. It felt like plunging into dark water, initially overwhelming, then strangely restorative. Lysander's fingers curled around hers with a gentleness that suggested he was terrified of breaking her, and together they turned toward the center of the library, toward a section of floor that Evangeline was certain had been ordinary stone moments before. An archway had appeared, or perhaps had always been there, and only now revealed itself to her blood-touched eyes. Candlelit stairs descended into darkness, and from below came a sound that was almost music, a low frequency that resonated in her bones and made her understand, with certainty that transcended knowledge, that this was the heartbeat of the manor itself. As they descended, Lysander spoke, his voice carrying centuries of pain and longing. "Below us lies the ballroom where the boundary between worlds grows thin, where blood remembers its purpose, and souls recognize their counterpart across the span of immortality. Your grandmother danced there with me, only in memory and dream. But you..." He paused on the stairs, turning to look at her in the candlelight. "You might dance there in truth, and in that dancing, we might finally become whole." The stairs descended deeper, and the darkness above gave way to a light that wasn't fire or candle, but something emanating from the very stones themselves, a faint, phosphorescent glow that turned the shadows into silver. And when they reached the bottom, Evangeline found herself standing in a ballroom that could not possibly exist within the manor's physical dimensions. It was vast as a cathedral, with walls of black marble that reflected the faint luminescence into infinity. In the center of the floor, a mosaic depicted scenes of binding figures, pressing palm to palm, veins flowing with light, something sacred and terrible happening in the space between heartbeats. And standing in corners and shadows, watching with eyes that glowed red in the darkness, were witnesses to every blood covenant ever made in this place. Ghosts, Evangeline realized. The accumulated spirits of every woman who had bound themselves to the darkness in hopes of redemption. And as the temperature dropped further, and Lysander pulled her into the center of the ballroom floor, Evangeline understood that she was not entering a room. She was entering a choice. The ballroom music was not sound. It was a vibration that resonated in her chest cavity, a frequency that seemed to sync with her heartbeat until she could no longer distinguish where her pulse ended and the manor's darkness began. Lysander moved her through the space with the practiced grace of someone who had danced in centuries past, when waltzes were scandal and the touch of gloved hands could communicate entire conversations. "We don't have to do this tonight," he said, and his voice carried the strain of barely restrained hunger. "You should understand what a blood covenant means before." "My grandmother's journal made it clear," Evangeline interrupted. Her hand had found the curve of his neck, and she was amazed by the reality of him, the fine texture of his skin, the strength in the tendons, the utterly human warmth of intention beneath the supernatural cold. "Tell me what you need. Tell me what you want." Lysander's eyes closed. When they opened again, the amber at their centers had expanded until almost no gray remained. "I want to stop being alone," he said with devastating simplicity. "I want to hear your thoughts in my mind when the sun forces us apart. I want to taste the centuries that live in your blood and have them recognize me as something other than monster. I want to bind myself to you so completely that when I close my eyes, I don't see the chapel where I fell. I see instead whatever you're seeing. I become present rather than merely existing." He pulled her closer, and she felt the resistance in his body, the effort it cost him to maintain the distance between her throat and his mouth. "But more than that," he continued, "I want you to understand what you would be choosing. The blood covenant is not simple. When a mortal binds to one like me, they don't simply gain access to my memories and my senses. They gain my hunger, my need, my capacity for darkness. And in exchange, I gain your light, your humanity, your ability to perceive the world as something other than a hunting ground. It's a balance, but it's not an easy one." Evangeline pulled back just far enough to meet his eyes. "Show me," she said. "Show me everything. Not just the abstraction. Show me what you actually are." She saw the moment his control wavered, saw the calculation in his expression as he weighed the risk of true revelation against the possibility of connection. And then, slowly, with the care of someone removing armor, Lysander let the veneer of humanity fall away. His fangs emerged not grotesque, but elegant, like something carved from pearl. The amber in his eyes expanded until it consumed the gray entirely, and his skin took on a luminescence that made him seem carved from moonlight. When he moved, it was no longer restrained. He was suddenly faster, more fluid, the predator that had survived 3 centuries by being precisely what he needed to be, to feed. Evangeline's heart rate spiked, but not from fear, from recognition. This was the thing that lived in her blood, the ancient knowledge of what he was. This was the vampire that she'd been dreaming of, not the careful, haunted man who'd held back his hunger in the candlelit bedroom. This was honesty. "Beautiful," she breathed. "You're beautiful like this." He made a sound, something between a growl and a whimper, and pulled her against his chest. "If you want this," he whispered against her hair, "then we must do it properly. In the old way. A full blood exchange. Not just a taste. We must open the veins and let ourselves bleed into each other until the line between your body and mine becomes permeable." "Where?" she asked. He pulled back, and with that simple motion, fangs receded, and humanity reasserted itself, less a covering than a choice. She realized. The vampire and the man were not separate things. They were one entity, both real, both essential to who he was. "Here," he said, pointing to the location where the ballroom mosaic showed 2 figures with wrists pressed together, light flowing between them. "The center of the binding place, where every covenant made in this house has been sealed." Evangeline followed him to the mosaic. Up close, she could see the detail with which the ancient craftspeople had rendered the scenes, the ecstasy and agony intertwined on the faces of the bound, the way light seemed to flow through them as if they were becoming transparent. "Take my wrist," Lysander instructed. He extended his arm, and in the phosphorescent light, She could see the scars that crisscrossed his skin, centuries of bloodlettings, of feedings, of connections made and severed. When I feed, when I draw the blood, you will feel me in every nerve ending. You will taste what I have tasted. You will see what I have seen, and more than that, you will feel what I have felt centuries of hunger, of longing, of a love that transcended mortality and damnation. And you will feel me, she said, understanding flickering to life in her mind. I will feel your humanity burning against my darkness like a candle in a cathedral. I will feel your capacity for hope, for connection, for seeing redemption in something that doesn't deserve it. And perhaps, he paused, and there was such vulnerability in his expression that she wanted to shield him from it. Perhaps you will teach me to hope as well. Evangeline brought his wrist to her lips. She could feel the pulse beneath his skin, not quite a human heartbeat, but something similar. Something that suggested there was still a core of life at the center of what he had become. I'm going to bite, she said. I know. She did. And the taste was transcendent, ancient spices, minerals, something that carried the memory of sunlight on skin centuries previous. The blood was thick, almost textured, and as she drew from him, she felt something opening in her mind like a door swinging inward. Visions poured through. A cathedral in candlelight, stained glass windows depicting saints. A young man impossibly young compared to the centuries in his eyes now kneeling at an altar, receiving communion, believing still in the possibility of grace. And then a shadow falling across the light, and something beautiful and terrible descending, and the young priest's mouth opening in a scream that never quite formed because fangs were sinking into his throat, and the last thing he felt as mortal was the dissolution of faith itself. Then the centuries afterward, the hunting, the killing, the slow transformation of hunger, from something that felt like a violation into something that felt like survival. Cities burning and being rebuilt, wars beginning and ending, the rise and fall of kingdoms while he remained, unchanging, trapped in the amber of his own eternal damnation. And then, more recently, dreams of a woman he'd never met, growing stronger, more vivid, until he realized that somewhere in the world, the ancient bloodline was being awakened in someone new. The manor had told him. The stones had sung it in the darkness. And he'd waited, century after century of waiting, for her to finally arrive. The vision shattered as Lysander pulled his wrist away from her mouth and brought it to his own lips, drinking from the mark she'd made. And now it was her turn to feel the feeding, the piercing ecstasy of his fangs sinking into her throat, the almost painful pleasure of being drawn into, consumed by, integrated with something vastly older and more powerful than herself. She felt herself opening to him her memories, her thoughts, her capacity for love flowing out like opened veins. She felt him drinking deeply, not just of blood, but of essence. And she felt him transform as he did, felt the darkness in him beginning to illuminate as it made contact with her light. The ballroom around them began to glow more brightly. The phosphorescence in the stones intensified until the entire space was lit by a silver luminescence that seemed to come from the blood itself. And Evangeline realized that she could feel him, actually feel Lysander's thoughts, his sensations, his vast and terrible loneliness finally meeting something that could understand it. I can feel you, she tried to communicate, unsure if words existed anymore, or if they'd become something simpler, more essential. Yes, came his response. Not in her ears, but in her bones. This is the binding. This is what it means. We are not separate anymore, Evangeline. Your heartbeat is my heartbeat. Your thoughts are my thoughts. We are becoming one. The feeding continued, deep and intense, neither willing to break the connection. Blood flowed between them, and with each exchange, the distance between them seemed to collapse. She felt herself expanding, becoming vast enough to contain centuries. She felt him contracting, becoming concentrated enough to exist in a single moment of presence. And when they finally pulled apart, gasping, it was with the understanding that something fundamental had shifted in the architecture of their beings. Evangeline looked down at her wrist. The mark was already fading, the puncture wounds closing with supernatural speed. And when she brought her hand up, she found that she could see through her own skin, could see the blood flowing beneath, not red but luminescent, shimmering with something that was no longer entirely human. What have we done? She whispered. We've begun the transformation, Lysander said, and his voice carried harmonics that seemed to come from multiple places at once. You have taken my blood into your body, and I have taken yours. We are bound now, you and I, not just in covenant, but in essence. When the sun rises tomorrow, you will feel the pull of darkness. You will need to shelter from it, or risk burning. And I. He reached out and touched her face, and she felt the wonder in him like a physical thing. I will spend the entire day inside your mind, experiencing light through your senses, experiencing warmth through your blood. Am I becoming like you? She asked, suddenly afraid. Am I becoming a vampire? No, he said softly. You are becoming something new, something that has not existed before. You will be bound to the night as I am. Yes, but you will retain your humanity, your capacity for sunlight, your ability to move between worlds. You are becoming a bridge, Evangeline, between the living and the undying, between my darkness and the light that still exists in your blood. He pulled her close again, and this time his embrace was not restrained. It held her fully, completely, with the strength of centuries and the tenderness of something newly reborn. And I, he whispered against her hair, I am becoming something less monstrous. Because of you. Always. Because of you. The morning after the covenant burned through her like fire. Evangeline woke in the manor's master bedroom. She had no memory of ascending the stairs from the ballroom, though Lysander assured her it had been she who'd walked them, not he, with a sensation as if her very skin had been turned inside out. Every nerve ending sang with an awareness she'd never possessed before. She could feel the weight of each sunbeam passing through the windows, could sense them like invisible hands pressing against the glass, demanding entry. It hurt, not physically, but with an ache that transcended the body. It was as if her blood had begun to remember that it belonged to darkness, and the sunlight was an intrusion, a violation of the ancient covenant that lived in her cells now. It will pass, Lysander said. He stood in the shadows of the window curtains, unable to move into the direct light without burning, though he existed in the periphery with a presence she could feel as clearly as if he were touching her. Your body is adjusting to the binding. The daylight was never meant to touch what you are becoming. Evangeline pushed herself upright, and the world spun with a vertigo that took her breath away. She could see more now. The shadows in the room had texture, depth, movement. They were not absences of light, but presences in themselves, and within them, she could perceive shapes that her mortal eyes would have missed entirely. She could see the ghosts. They moved through the manor's corridors in a procession, trailing light like water. Some were recent. She could see the particularity of their features, the way they wore clothes from her grandmother's era. Others were ancient, their forms barely cohesive, existing as suggestions rather than solid shape, and she could feel them. What are they? She gasped. All those who have made the blood covenant in this place, Lysander said softly. Your grandmother among them, though she has found her way to peace now, bound no longer. These others, they remain because their transformations were incomplete. They burned too brightly in the daylight, and were not vampire enough to survive in darkness. They became trapped between states, and the manor has held them here, unable to move forward, unable to find rest. Evangeline felt a wave of compassion so intense it brought tears to her eyes. She understood, with the knowledge that the blood covenant had given her, exactly what these spirits endured, the pain of existing without truly living, the punishment of damnation, without the consolation of becoming something wholly other. Can they be helped? She asked. Perhaps, Lysander said. If you are willing to understand them, if you are willing to let them teach you the true history of this place, not the sanitized version that your grandmother could convey, but the reality of what the Ashworth bloodline has always been. Over the following days, as Evangeline's body adjusted to its hybrid nature, able to move in daylight, but in pain, drawn to darkness, but not consumed by it, she found herself communing with the manor's ghosts. They came to her in dreams, and in the drowsy hours of dawn, when the light was soft enough to allow Lysander to remain partially manifest, his form visible in the shadows. Through them, she learned, the Ashworth line had never been witches in the colloquial sense. They were priestesses of something far older than Christianity, worshippers of the cycles of blood and moon, practitioners of rituals that existed in the liminal spaces between life and death. Her ancestors had made pacts with vampires not from seduction or darkness, but from genuine spiritual alignment. They understood that the boundary between living and dead was permeable, that consciousness persisted beyond corporeal form, that hunger itself could be transcended through connection. The manor had been built as a temple to that understanding, a place where the binding ceremonies could occur with full awareness and consent, where the transformation from human to something other could be guided rather than violently imposed. But over generations, something had gone wrong. The later Ashworth women had lost the knowledge. They'd treated the blood covenant as a kind of romantic conquest, a way to bind themselves to eternally beautiful lovers, without understanding the cost. Some had been destroyed by the transformation. Their bodies couldn't handle the strain of containing both mortal and immortal essence. Others had gone mad from the weight of experiencing the centuries through their vampires' memories. And the vampires had changed as well, their original understanding of the covenant as a spiritual communion degrading into pure hunger. Blood had become about sustenance rather than connection. Love had become about possession rather than true meeting. It was Margot, Evangeline's grandmother, who had begun the restoration. She learned this from Margot's ghost itself, a form that shimmered in the library, almost luminescent, showing the woman as she'd been in her prime rather than at her end. I understood what had been lost, Margot's ghost said, speaking directly to Evangeline's mind in the new language the binding had given her. I sought out Lysander not because I loved him romantically, though I grew to care for him deeply, but because I recognized in him the capacity to remember what the covenant had been. Together, we spent decades restoring the old knowledge, reclaiming the spirituality that had been buried under centuries of dysfunction. But you didn't complete the transformation, Evangeline said. You didn't become what I'm becoming. I was already old, her grandmother replied. And I had a greater gift to give than my own transformation. I had a granddaughter whose blood sang with the ancient magic. I had the ability to ensure that you would inherit not just the manner, but the knowledge of what you were meant to become. In the nights that followed, Lysander began teaching her what Margot had taught him. He brought her to the crypt beneath the manor, where the bones of ancient priestesses lay in stone coffins carved with epitaphs, in languages that predated written history. He showed her the library's secret vault, filled with grimoires bound in skin and written in blood, containing the true rituals of the blood covenant, not the corrupted versions, but the original ceremonies designed to create genuine communion between mortal and immortal. And slowly, as she read and learned and allowed the centuries to settle into her bones, Evangeline began to understand what she was becoming. Not a victim of transformation, but a priestess in her own right. Not a mortal lover of a vampire, but a bridge between worlds. A consciousness capable of holding both the eternal perspective of immortality and the precious intensity of mortal time. Not trapped between states, but deliberately existing in both. I can feel the change accelerating, she told Lysander one night, as they stood together in the ballroom, where they'd made their covenant. It's not painful anymore. It's like I'm remembering something I've always known. You are, Lysander confirmed. He looked different now as well, less tortured, less haunted. The weight of centuries seemed to rest more lightly on his shoulders. The covenant is working as it was always meant to. You are awakening to your true nature, and I am being drawn back toward humanity. We are meeting in the middle, becoming something new together. He extended his hand, and Evangeline took it. This time, when they danced, the ballroom danced with them. The mosaic beneath their feet glowed with each step. The ghosts of the previous covenant-bound watched not with anguish, but with something approaching hope. And high above, in the manor's towers, the bleeding mirrors finally ran clear. On the 21st night after the covenant, Evangeline experienced her first full transformation. It began at dusk, with a burning sensation in her veins, not painful, but intensely alive. Lysander had warned her, had prepared her as much as any preparation could, but nothing could have truly readied her for the experience of her body becoming something other than what it had always been. She stood in the master bedroom, as the last light drained from the sky, and felt her mortality begin to burn away. Her skin took on a luminescence, phosphorescent, silver-white in the gathering darkness. Her teeth sharpened, canines extending into fangs as pearl-like as Lysander's, though when she ran her tongue across them, she felt something that belonged wholly to her, not imported, but grown from within. Her eyes shifted through a spectrum of colors before settling on a gray amber that was neither fully human nor wholly vampire, but something uniquely hers. And her senses. She could perceive the entire manor at once, could feel every stone, every shadow, every ghost that haunted its corridors, could sense the blood flowing through Lysander's veins from across the room, could taste his centuries on the air like a perfume, could hear the heartbeats of the mice in the walls, the pulse of trees on the moors beyond, the distant thrum of human life in the village miles away. It's too much, she gasped, and her voice came out layered with harmonics that belonged to multiple registers simultaneously. I can hear everything. I can feel everything. Lysander crossed the room in a motion too fast for mortal eyes to follow. He took her trembling hands, and his touch grounded her, provided a focal point for the overwhelming cascade of sensation. Breathe, he instructed. Not because you need to, but because the motion will help organize your thoughts. Your mind is trying to process centuries of sensory expansion in a moment. It will settle. You will learn to filter, to focus, to exist comfortably in this expanded state. But even as he spoke, Evangeline felt something shift. The fangs retracted. The luminescence faded from her skin, cycling back to something closer to her original complexion, though with a subtle luminosity that suggested something other than purely human. Her senses remained heightened, but no longer overwhelming now. They felt like an additional layer of perception rather than a replacement for what she'd always known. "What just happened?" she demanded. "Why did I revert?" "You didn't," Lysander said. There was wonder in his voice. "You integrated." The priestesses of the old blood were always meant to transform, thus not into full vampires, but into something capable of existing in both states. You can be wholly mortal in daylight, wholly supernatural in darkness, and everywhere in between, existing in whatever state the moment demands. Evangeline looked down at her hands and saw that they were hers, not transformed, but more essentially themselves than they'd ever been. She could feel the blood moving beneath her skin, could sense the power coiled in her muscles, could perceive the neural networks of her own mind firing with unprecedented clarity. "I've been waiting 300 years for this," Lysander said quietly. "Waiting for a woman of the bloodline strong enough to not just survive the covenant, but to thrive in it. To become what the priestesses were always meant to be." He kissed her then, and the kiss was different from anything they'd shared before. There was no careful restraint now. He kissed her as an equal, as another being of darkness and power, and she kissed him back with the intensity of someone who finally belonged to the same fundamental reality he inhabited. But the kiss was interrupted by a sound. It came from downstairs, the unmistakable crash of breaking glass, accompanied by the smell of accelerant and the crackle of flames beginning to take hold. "Fire," Evangeline said, understanding it not through sight but through the sensations flooding through her new senses. "Someone is burning the manor." They descended to the ground floor to find the library already consumed by flames. The furniture was burning, the ancient books, the journals, the grimoires that contained centuries of knowledge, and standing in the center of the inferno, holding torches and wearing the white robes of the Order of Divine Judgment, were humans, vampire hunters. Evangeline had heard of them in the old stories, in the memories that Lysander carried in his blood. But seeing them in reality, seeing the certainty in their eyes, the righteous fervor with which they fed the flames, gave the concept a visceral weight. "Abominations," one of the hunters called out, spotting them at the edge of the burning library. "Servants of darkness, by the authority of the Church and the sanctity of God's creation, I command you to submit yourselves for judgment." "There is no judgment here but entropy," Lysander said calmly. He moved in front of Evangeline, protective, though she realized now that she needed no protection. She could sense the hunters' heartbeats, could taste the fear in their blood. They were mortal, fragile, killable. "Your order has been hunting my kind for centuries, always in the name of righteousness. But you have never understood what we are, or why we exist." "Demons require no understanding," the hunter replied. He raised a crossbow, and Evangeline realized with a surge of protective fury that it was aimed at Lysander. The bolt was tipped with something silver, she sensed, an ancient vampire killer that would pierce his heart if it found its mark. She moved. Later, she would have difficulty articulating what happened in those moments. She was not accustomed to the speed of which she was now capable, and the motion happened before thought could govern it. She found herself between Lysander and the hunter, her hand raised, and the bolt struck her palm with a force that drove her backward. It burned, silver and blessed iron, designed to wound the undying, and it burned through her hybrid flesh with an intensity that brought her to her knees. But she did not fall, could not fall. Lysander's arms were around her, his voice a desperate mantra in her mind. "Don't let go. Don't surrender to the pain. You are stronger than this. You are priestess. You are covenant-bound. You are meant for this." And she was. Evangeline pulled the bolt from her palm and felt the wound begin healing immediately, the flesh knitting together beneath the silver as if it had never been pierced. The pain receded, and something else took its place. Fury, ancient, righteous, divine. She stood, and when she did, the hunters fell back. They could sense it. She realized the power that had awakened in her, the centuries of knowledge and magic that the bloodline carried. They could feel the truth of what she was, not a demon, not an abomination, but a priestess of an older faith, and she would not allow them to burn the library that contained her family's spiritual inheritance. The hunters began to run, but Lysander caught them before they could escape, moving with a predator's grace, fangs bared. And Evangeline, watching as he fed on the blood he'd been denied for 3 centuries of isolation, felt something awaken in her that was neither monstrous nor righteous, but simply necessary. This was the darkness. Not something to be denied or suppressed, but integrated, understood, accepted as part of what she was. When it was over, the hunters were dead, and the manor was burning around them. Lysander looked at her with an expression that combined hunger and awe in equal measure. "What have you become?" he whispered. "What we were always meant to be together," Evangeline replied, and she reached out her hand, pulling him toward the exit, toward the night beyond. As they fled the manor, she felt something shift in her perception. The building was burning away, but what it revealed wasn't destruction, it was transformation. The stone beneath the flames was older, deeper, part of a structure that existed not entirely in the physical world but in the liminal spaces between dimensions. The true manor, she realized, the sacred place that had always existed beneath the Victorian facade. And standing in its threshold, Lysander took her hand, and together they crossed into whatever lay beyond. The Coven Council convened 3 nights later in an ancient cathedral that existed somewhere outside normal geography. Evangeline understood this even as she struggled to comprehend how they'd arrived one moment standing in the burning manor, the next existing in this vast space of black marble and candlelit arches, surrounded by entities that made Lysander seem almost human by comparison. There were 6 of them, ancient vampires, the eldest of whom bore the weight of nearly 2,000 years in their gaze. They sat on thrones carved from a single piece of obsidian, and their presence was so overwhelming that Evangeline's newly awakened senses felt like they were drowning in the magnitude of their power. Lysander, the central figure, said a being of such age that their true form seemed to flicker between genders and species. "You have violated the covenant of silence. You have exposed the existence of our kind to a mortal, and you have permitted her to consume your blood and yours to consume hers, creating a union that should not exist outside the bloodline sanctuary. I have done these things," Lysander said calmly. He stood before them without fear, though Evangeline could sense the tension coiled in his muscles. "And I would do them again." "Then you doom yourself." "Another figure," interjected a woman, whose beauty was so terrible it hurt to perceive. "The law is ancient and absolute. Vampires do not create bonds outside the council's sanction. Mortals do not live to remember what they have learned. The girl must die, and you must be sealed in the earth for a century of darkness, that you might contemplate your transgression." "The girl," Evangeline said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice, "is standing here, fully conscious and perfectly capable of speaking on her own behalf." The council turned its collective attention to her, and the weight of their regard nearly crushed her. But she had centuries of blood memory now. An ancient power sang in her veins. She met their gaze without flinching. "I am Evangeline Ashworth," she continued, "last of the priestess bloodline. I have made covenant with Lysander of my own will, understanding fully what it meant, and I stand here to tell you that your laws are dying because they have forgotten their origin." "Speak quickly," the central figure commanded. "Your life depends upon what comes next." Evangeline reached out, and Lysander took her hand. In that touch, she could feel his fear, his love, his desperate hope that she could somehow save them both from the council's judgment. "The covenant of silence was created to protect your kind from persecution," she said. "But it was created for a specific purpose, to preserve the sacred knowledge that only the priestess bloodline could carry. Blood memory is what separates your kind from mere predators. The ability to remember, to connect across centuries, to transform hunger into communion. You have forgotten this." The council leaned forward, interested despite themselves. "My family made the first covenant with your kind," Evangeline continued. "Not as victims, but as partners. Not as vessels for your hunger, but as equals in a spiritual practice that transcended death. My ancestors understood that what you are is not a curse, but a transformation. And what we, the priestesses, are is not a prey species, but a counterbalance. Together, vampire and priestess create something sacred. Apart, you become what you fear most, mere beasts." "And what proof have you of these grand claims?" the beautiful woman demanded. Evangeline drew Lysander's hand to her throat, revealing the marks where he'd fed, but she didn't stop there. She opened her senses fully, allowing the council to perceive her transformation through her own expanded awareness. They could see through her eyes what she could see, the spiritual geometry of the manor, the way the blood covenant had rewritten the laws of mortality and damnation simultaneously. The truth that Lysander was not the monster he'd believed himself to be, but something sacred in transition. "I offer myself as proof," she said. "A priestess, fully awakened, bound to this vampire in the old way. If your laws are just, then examine us. And if we are found wanting, I will accept the judgment." For a long moment, silence filled the cathedral. The candles flickered without wind. The darkness seemed to deepen, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Then the central figure stood. "We will examine the covenant," it announced. "Bring forth the vessels of truth." And suddenly, Evangeline and Lysander were no longer standing before the council, but existing in some other state, not physical, but not purely mental either. They existed simultaneously in the memory of every blood exchange they'd ever made, reliving each moment with absolute clarity while the council observed. The council saw everything. They saw the first touch in the mirror. They saw the moment Lysander had allowed himself to hope. They saw Evangeline's willingness to cross thresholds that most mortals would never even perceive. They saw the genuine transformation in Lysander, the way the darkness in him had begun to illuminate, to remember its original purpose. And they saw, most importantly, the reciprocal transformation in Evangeline, the way her humanity had not been diminished by the darkness, but deepened. The way she carried both states within her without being torn apart by the contradiction. When the examination ended, Evangeline and Lysander found themselves kneeling before the thrones, both gasping as if they'd been holding their breath for eternity. "The priestess speaks truth," the beautiful woman said, and there was something approaching wonder in her voice. "I remember now. I remember the old ways. I remember what it was to be more than hunger." One by one, the other council members nodded. The central figure descended from its throne and approached Evangeline. It extended a hand, and without thinking, she took it. The contact brought a flood of visions, centuries of the council maintaining their isolation, growing more rigid in their laws, more absolute in their refusal to accept their nature as anything other than predatory, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, beginning to remember the alternative, the sacred dimension that existed beneath the survival. "You have reminded us of what we forgot," the ancient being said. "For this gift, you are granted something unprecedented, the status of priestess bound, recognized by all covens, protected by all ancient laws, and your companion." It turned to Lysander. "Your sentence is commuted, but you must serve as teacher to those of our kind who wish to remember. You must guide them back toward the spiritual practice that once defined your existence." Lysander inclined his head. "I will serve." Gladly. The council reconvened on their thrones, and this time, when they examined the pair, it was with something approaching respect. "Go," the central figure commanded. "Return to your manor. Rebuild it from whatever foundation remains, and know that you go forth with the blessing of the ancient council." Chapter 8. Blood and desire converge. The manor wasn't truly destroyed, Evangeline discovered when they returned. The Victorian facade had burned away completely, leaving behind nothing but ash and scattered stone. But beneath it, the true building remained ancient, built of materials that couldn't be consumed by mortal flame. The ballroom where they'd made their covenant was untouched. The library's secret vault remained sealed, and the crypt beneath held the bones of their ancestors exactly as they'd been for centuries. It took 3 weeks to clear the rubble. 3 weeks during which Evangeline found herself existing more fully in the hybrid state than either pure mortal or pure vampire. She spent her daylight hours in the sunlight, teaching her body to exist comfortably in that state, re-anchoring herself to the mortal world that still contained the vast majority of humanity, and she spent her nights in the darkness with Lysander, learning the centuries, integrating the weight of his memories into the architecture of her own consciousness. The nights were when the binding truly deepened. One evening, as autumn storms began to roll across the moors, Lysander brought her to a chamber she'd never seen before, a circular room carved entirely from black marble, with a ceiling so high it vanished into darkness. In the center was a pool of still water that reflected nothing, not even candlelight. "The mirror pool," Lysander explained. "This is where the original priestesses came, when they wished to merge fully with their vampire counterpart, not in blood, but in consciousness. It is dangerous. The merging can shatter minds that are not compatible. But I think..." He looked at her with such tenderness it made her chest ache. "I think we are compatible." Evangeline approached the pool. She could feel something emanating from it, not evil, but vast, ancient, demanding. "What happens? You see each other," Lysander said. "Truly see each other. Not as you appear, but as you are. Every shadow, every secret, every shame and every glory. It is a kind of death, and a kind of resurrection. She took his hand, and together they descended into the pool. The water was neither hot nor cold, but something in between, a temperature that matched her own body perfectly. As she went deeper, the sensation of water faded, replaced by something more like moving through her own consciousness. And when she surfaced, she was somewhere else entirely. They were standing together in a space that had no physical dimensions. There was no ground, no sky, only the two of them, and the absolute clarity of mutual perception. Evangeline saw Lysander first as he was, centuries of hunger held in check by a will, iron strong and increasingly terrified. She saw the young priest he'd been, full of faith and hope, before the transformation had shattered everything he'd believed about himself. She saw the predator he'd become, the centuries of feeding and isolation, the slow degradation of his humanity, until he'd believed himself truly monstrous. But she also saw the truth beneath that. She saw the way he'd maintained his capacity for love despite everything, the way he'd cared for her grandmother with genuine affection, the way he'd waited in darkness for someone like her to arrive, not from desperation or hunger, but from a deep, essential longing to be known by something that understood. And Lysander saw her. He saw the child she'd been, lonely and oddly prescient, always aware that there was something more to existence than what ordinary life contained. He saw the hospice worker she'd become, holding the hands of the dying, learning to exist comfortably with death while maintaining her capacity for compassion. And he saw who she was, becoming a priestess in her own right, containing centuries of memory and knowledge while maintaining the precious intensity of mortal perspective. He saw her fear, her uncertainty about whether she'd made the right choice, whether binding herself to darkness had been transformation or tragedy. And he saw her love. Not romantic love, though that was there too, burning like candlelight, but something deeper. A love that came from finally finding another consciousness that could meet hers without fear. A love that transcended species and mortality, and the boundary between living and undying. "I love you," he said, and the words resonated through whatever space they inhabited. "Not because you saved me from damnation, not because you're beautiful, or because your blood is magical, but because you're you, and you chose to see me as something other than monster. And in that choice, you made me capable of believing it myself." "I love you," Evangeline replied, "not because you're immortal or powerful or tragic, but because when I'm with you, I feel like I'm finally whole. Like all the fractured parts of myself, the mortal and the priestess, the light and the darkness finally fit together into something that makes sense." They moved toward each other, and when they touched, something shifted in the fabric of the space around them. The emptiness filled with light, not blinding, but warm, present, alive. And in that light, Evangeline could see the manor as it was meant to be. Not a gothic fortress of darkness, but a sacred sanctuary where the boundaries between worlds grew thin, where vampires could remember what they were meant to be, where priestesses could integrate their power without losing their humanity. They made love there, in that space between dimensions, and it was unlike anything Evangeline had ever experienced. It wasn't physical. There were no bodies to inhabit, no flesh to be touched, but it was every bit as intimate as physical union, perhaps more so, because it was the merging of consciousness itself. They became each other and remained themselves simultaneously. They felt what the other felt, knew what the other knew, loved what the other loved, and when they finally separated, it was with the understanding that they had become something new. Not vampire and priestess, but a single consciousness inhabiting two bodies, not bound by blood covenant alone, but by a union of spirit that transcended even that sacred exchange. When they emerged from the pool, the manor around them had transformed. The ballroom was no longer empty, but filled with people, the ghosts of previous covenant bound, now peaceful, no longer trapped in the liminal space between life and death. And there, most luminescent of all, was Margot's ghost, her expression radiating approval. "You have completed what I began." Her voice resonated through Evangeline's consciousness. "You have restored the covenant to its original purpose. The manor is a sanctuary again, and Lysander, my dear friend, is finally free." The winter solstice arrived with snow that fell in patterns too geometric to be accidental, as if the universe itself was decorating the manor for ceremony. Over the preceding months, Evangeline and Lysander had begun receiving visitors. Other vampires, drawn by the whispers spreading through the councils, came to learn the restoration of the old practices. Some were ancient, bearing the weight of centuries as Lysander did. Others were younger, turned in the last few decades, desperate for understanding of what they'd been cursed to become. Evangeline found herself becoming a teacher. She held ceremonies in the ballroom, guiding vampires through the process of meditation that would allow them to access their blood memories. Not the recent past, but the ancient past, before the laws of isolation had been instituted. When vampire and priestess had worked together in partnership, Lysander established a library of restoration. He spent his daylight hours time that he could now exist in through Evangeline's anchoring presence, cataloging the ancient grimoires, reconstructing the ceremonial texts, ensuring that what had been lost was not forgotten again. But as the solstice approached, they received a visitor that changed everything. She arrived on the evening of the winter solstice eve, a woman who had to be at least as ancient as the council's central figure. She wore the shape of a human, but it was clear that this was merely a convenience, that her true form existed in dimensions that mortal perception couldn't quite accommodate. "I am Selena," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that suggested she was speaking in multiple languages simultaneously. "Original priestess of the Ashworth bloodline. I have watched your transformation with interest, granddaughter through the centuries. I have come to offer you a choice." Evangeline felt Lysander tense beside her, but she remained calm. She'd felt this moment approaching through the blood. Memories knew somehow that this convergence was not random, but inevitable. "What choice?" she asked. "The priestess bloodline was created specifically to serve as anchors for the sacred practice," Selena explained. "Each priestess lives approximately 200 years, maintaining the spiritual knowledge through her lifetime, then passing it to the next generation. But you are different. The blood covenant with Lysander has granted you the capacity to live indefinitely, as he does. You are becoming an immortal priestess, something that has not existed since the very beginning of our order." "What are you offering me?" Evangeline pressed. "The ability to shape what comes next," Selena said. "Your grandmother saw the corruption of the old ways and began the restoration, but she was limited by her mortal lifespan. You are not. You have centuries ahead of you, millennia, potentially. You could spend them rebuilding the covenant, teaching the priestess practices to new generations of women who inherit the bloodline. You could become a living bridge between vampire and priestess kind, ensuring that what was nearly lost is preserved for all time." Evangeline considered this. She could feel Lysander's emotions through their bond, his hope that she would stay, his fear that the offer would be too tempting to refuse, and beneath that, his willingness to accept whatever choice she made. "What about Lysander?" she asked. "His role in this?" "He would be your partner in restoration," Selena said. "The first vampire to openly serve the priestess order, rather than existing in opposition to it. Together, you would re-establish the balance that existed before the councils insisted on separation. He would become a teacher of the sacred practices to other vampires who wished to remember, and you would become a teacher of priestess magic to the mortal women of your bloodline." It was a vision of eternity that Evangeline could actually envision, not as burden, but as purpose. "I accept," she said, "but with one condition." "State it," Selena commanded. "That Lysander and I undergo a final covenant, one that the entire order witnesses, not a blood covenant, but a spiritual one, acknowledging our union not as bound mortals, but as eternal partners in the restoration of the sacred way." The ceremony took place in the ballroom at midnight, with every priestess ghost and every vampire who had come to the manor in the preceding months bearing witness. Lysander and Evangeline stood in the center of the mosaic that had graced that space since its creation, with the candles arranged in patterns that had not been attempted since the 1500s. Selena performed the ritual herself, speaking words in languages so ancient they seemed to predate human speech. She bound their hands together with a cord woven from the hair of priestesses and vampires, both symbols of their dual nature, their commitment to the bridge between worlds. As the words were spoken, something shifted in the fabric of reality itself. The manor expanded, or perhaps space within it rearranged, and suddenly it was possible to see all the rooms simultaneously: the ballroom, the library, the crypt, and dozens of chambers that Evangeline didn't remember existing before. Each one was illuminated by candlelight, and in each one, she could perceive potential: a teaching space, a sanctuary, a healing chamber, a place of restoration. "The manor reveals its true form," Lysander whispered. His hand, still bound to hers, trembled. "I have waited 3 centuries for this." When the ceremony concluded, Selena stepped forward and pressed her palm to Evangeline's forehead, transferring knowledge directly into her consciousness. Evangeline gasped as centuries of priestess practice flooded into her rituals, meditations, ceremonies, the true names of power that allowed a woman of the bloodline to exist in full command of her supernatural abilities. And then it was Lysander's turn. Selena placed her hands on his shoulders, and her presence seemed to expand, encompassing not just the vampire but the entire manor itself. "You have sought redemption," she said, "and you have found it not in denial of what you are, but in integration. You are no longer cursed. You are no longer damned. You are a priestess's chosen partner, and in that choice, you are sanctified." The transformation that followed was subtle but profound. Lysander's appearance didn't change, but something in his expression shifted. The weight of damnation that had hung on him for centuries lifted, replaced by something like peace. When everyone had departed, leaving only Lysander and Evangeline alone in the ballroom as dawn approached, she turned to him and saw herself reflected in his eyes, no longer a mortal woman, no longer entirely human, but a priestess who had chosen darkness and found light within it. "Eternity," she said. "We've chosen eternity." "Yes," Lysander replied. He brought her hand to his lips, kissing the spot where centuries of blood exchanges had marked their covenant. An eternity together. A priestess and her vampire. A bridge between worlds. A love that transcends death and damnation both. The attack came in spring, when the manor was beginning to wake from winter's sleep. Evangeline had been working in the library, transcribing one of the ancient grimoires into modern language so that younger priestesses could more easily access the knowledge. When she felt the disturbance through her connection with Lysander, it was not pain. It was something more like disruption, the sudden sensation of a force acting against the manor's protective wards, attempting to sever the spiritual anchors that kept the sanctuary hidden from those who would do it harm. "Hunters," Lysander said, his form materializing from the shadows with sudden urgency. "The Order of Divine Judgment has found us. They've brought something with them, a relic, I think, something blessed, something capable of piercing the manor's defenses." Evangeline could feel it too now, the wrongness, the presence of priests and weapons moving across the moors toward the manor. And beneath it, something worse, the presence of another vampire, one so old that its consciousness felt like a wound in reality itself. Not just hunters, she realized, a vampire of the old council. They're working together. "My replacement," Lysander said with grim certainty. "After the council decided to honor our covenant, there was significant resistance. There were those who believed the ancient laws should remain absolute. They've sent one of their enforcers, bound with priests, to eliminate us and restore what they see as proper order." The manor trembled as something heavy struck its outer walls. Evangeline stood, and as she did, her form began to shift. The priestess robes she'd been wearing transformed into something that existed between garment and armor, spun from darkness itself, inscribed with the sigils of protection that the ancient bloodline had created. Her eyes burned with the full amber of her vampire heritage, and the power that had been quietly building since her transformation erupted forth like a second heartbeat. "We fight," she said simply. "This is not your battle," Lysander began. "It is precisely my battle," Evangeline interrupted. "I am a priestess of the ancient order. This manor is sacred ground, and you are my chosen partner. I will not cede either to forces that worship the boundary between dark and light, instead of understanding that the only sanctity lies in integration." She moved toward the library doors, Lysander at her side, and together they ascended to the manor's highest tower. Below, the hunters had begun their assault in earnest. They were using blessed fire, ancient rituals, weapons that sang with the weight of centuries of malice. But the manor's true wards were not physical. They existed in the liminal spaces, in the boundaries between dimensions, and the hunters could damage only the Victorian facade. What they could not touch was the sacred foundation. The vampire enforcer manifested in the ballroom, and Evangeline felt her breath catch. It was not in any human form, but existed as a presence vast, ancient, composed of such concentrated hunger that reality seemed to fracture around it. "You have violated the sacred laws," it communicated, not in sound but in direct consciousness invasion. "The priestess order exists to serve vampires, not to walk as equals. You have elevated this cursed creature beyond his proper station, and for this transgression, both of you must be unmade." "No," Evangeline responded, her consciousness expanding to meet the enforcer's projection. "The sacred laws exist to maintain balance. They were corrupted when vampires forgot that priestesses were partners, not servants. Lysander and I have restored what was forgotten, and we will not be unmade." The battle that followed existed partly in the physical world and partly in the spaces between, a conflict of consciousness as much as combat, a war between paradigms. Evangeline found herself channeling the power of every priestess who had come before her. Their strength flowed through her consciousness, their knowledge of the ancient magic guiding her hands. She could feel her grandmother's presence, could feel Selena's vast power flowing through the manor's foundations, could feel the accumulated spiritual force of centuries of covenant-bound priestesses lending their will to hers. Lysander fought alongside her, but differently. He was not trying to overcome the enforcer through force, but through remembrance. He spoke to it in languages that predated human civilization, reminding it of what it had once been before hunger had consumed everything else. He showed it the memory of the first vampire, before the laws of isolation, when creatures of darkness had walked hand in hand with priestesses of light, creating something sacred through their union. The enforcer resisted. But even as it resisted, something in it was beginning to remember. Evangeline saw the moment when the enforcer's consciousness began to fracture under the weight of those forgotten memories. It had been so certain of its own righteousness, so convinced that the laws of absolute separation were sacred and immutable, but confronted with the truth of what existed before those laws, confronted with the evidence that integration was possible, and beautiful, and transformative, it began to waver. "Stop," Evangeline said, reaching out with her consciousness to touch the vast presence that had come to destroy them. "You don't have to continue this. You don't have to serve the old laws. You can choose redemption, as Lysander has chosen. You can choose to remember what you were meant to be." For a moment, the enforcer seemed on the verge of accepting this offer. But then, outside the manor, the priest's ritual reached its crescendo. A wave of blessed power lashed against the manor's spiritual wards, and the enforcer seized that moment of distraction to strike. It came at Evangeline with all the force of its ancient hunger, and for the first time since her transformation, she felt genuine fear. This was not Lysander, whom she understood completely. This was not a hunter, whose mortal body could be overcome. This was an ancient vampire of vast power, and it wanted to destroy everything she and Lysander had built. She felt the fangs sink into her throat. She felt the tremendous force of its feeding, pulling not just blood but essence, attempting to drain the priestess magic that defined her. And as the darkness began to close in, at the edges of her consciousness, she made a choice. Instead of fighting the feeding, she surrendered to it. She opened herself completely, allowing her consciousness to merge with the enforcer's, showing it through her own perception the full truth of what she and Lysander had become. She showed it the beauty of their union, the transformation that integration had made possible. She showed it the manor as it truly was, not a den of corruption, but a sacred sanctuary where the ancient ways were being restored. And she showed it the price of her surrender, her own transformation into something other than what she had been. Because to pour that much power into another being, to offer that much of herself, meant changing fundamentally. She would not be the priestess she had been when the sun rose next. The enforcer felt this, understood it, and something in its ancient consciousness responded to the sacrifice. It released her. Evangeline fell backward into Lysander's arms, gasping, her blood burning from where the feeding had occurred. But even as she fell, she could feel the transformation accelerating. The priestess power that had been flowing through her was beginning to integrate more deeply, beginning to change her at a fundamental level. "What have you done?" Lysander cried, cradling her against his chest. "What had to be done," she managed. "Showed him that redemption requires sacrifice. That love is more powerful than hunger." Outside, the priests had ceased their ritual. The enforcer had withdrawn its assault on the manor's wards, and in the silence that followed, Evangeline could feel something shifting. The enforcer was leaving, not in defeat, but in transformation. It was going to seek out the ancient councils, was going to carry the message that the laws of separation were crumbling, that a new era of integration was beginning. "Stay with me," Lysander pleaded, but Evangeline could feel the darkness calling her deeper. "Always," she whispered, and let herself slip into the threshold between living and undying, priestess and vampire, mortal and eternal. Evangeline woke in the mirror pool, suspended in water that was neither water nor anything that mortal words could describe. She existed in a state of profound transformation. The mortal aspects of herself, the physical body, the biological imperatives, the linear perception of time, had been refined away, leaving only the essential core of her consciousness. She was no longer capable of existing in daylight without burning. But neither was she constrained by the hunger that had once defined vampire existence. She was something entirely new. When she surfaced from the pool, Lysander was waiting, and he wept when he saw her. "I thought I'd lost you," he said, pulling her against him with a desperation that spoke of centuries of isolation finally crystallizing into terror. "You can't lose me," Evangeline replied. Her voice had changed. It carried harmonics now that suggested multiple registers speaking in perfect synchronization. "I am bound to you. But more than that, I am bound to the manor, to the priestess order, to the work of restoration. I exist now as priestess and vampire both, without compromise or separation. I am what I was always meant to become." She looked down at her hands and saw that they glowed with a soft luminescence, not the harsh light of transformation, but something gentle, almost maternal. When she closed her eyes, she could see with perfect clarity not just the manor, but the spiritual geometry that underlay it. She could perceive the wards that protected it, the ancient power that flowed through its stones, the consciousness of countless priestesses and vampires who had come before her, now part of the manor's fabric. "The hunters?" she asked. "Fled when the enforcer withdrew," Lysander said. "Without the vampire's support, and with the manor's full power revealed, they realized their assault was hopeless. I think they will take word back to Rome that the old ways are not dead, that we are not demons to be hunted and destroyed. We are something else entirely." "The enforcer?" "Has gone to the council," Lysander said. "I can feel it through the connections the covenant created. It's telling them what you showed it, that the laws of separation have become prisons, that integration is possible and beautiful, that a new era is beginning whether the councils accept it or not." Evangeline moved to the mirror pool and looked at her reflection. She no longer looked entirely human, but neither did she appear monstrous. She was beautiful in a way that suggested multiple truths existing simultaneously, mortal and immortal, light and dark, priestess and vampire, all integrated into a single unified form. "How long?" she asked Lysander. "How long do we have?" "Forever," he replied, and he pulled her into an embrace. "The covenant binds us across the centuries, and now that you are what you are, you will not age, will not weaken, will not fade. You will teach the priestess practices, guide new priestesses as they awaken to their heritage, and I will work alongside you, helping vampires remember what they were meant to be. We have eternity. Our eternity," she said, feeling the weight of those words settle into her consciousness. Not the cold, endless eternity that Lysander suffered through, but a shared existence, a purpose, a meaning that extends beyond survival. As if in response to her words, the manor seemed to expand again. New rooms appeared, a chamber for the instruction of young priestesses, a sanctuary where vampires who wished to remember could meditate, a great library that seemed to contain every book that had ever been written, and 100 other spaces, each dedicated to some aspect of the sacred work of integration. "Your grandmother," Evangeline said, feeling the stirring of ancestral presence in the manor's depths. "She would be proud." "She is proud," Lysander corrected. "She exists in the manor now, part of its consciousness. All the priestesses do. They are witnesses to what you have become, and they celebrate it." Epilogue. The blood of moonlight. 5 years later, or was it 5 centuries? Time had become a strange thing for Evangeline. The manor hosted its first public gathering. Priestesses from across the world had come, women who had inherited the bloodline, women who carried the ancient magic in their cells, women who had sensed the stirring of something sacred waking in the darkness. They came seeking knowledge, seeking understanding, seeking the tools to integrate the light and dark that lived within them, and Evangeline taught them. She showed them how to access blood memory without requiring a vampire's embrace. She demonstrated the priestess meditations that allowed the ancient wisdom to surface into consciousness. She guided them through rituals of integration, helping them understand that their capacity for darkness was not a curse, but a gift, a way of perceiving reality that opened doors closed to strictly mortal perception. Lysander worked alongside her, helping the younger priestesses understand the vampire perspective. He no longer looked tormented. The centuries of isolation and self-loathing had been replaced by purpose, by the knowledge that his existence had meaning beyond mere survival. And when the night of the blood moon arrived, Evangeline stood with him on the manor's highest tower, looking out across the moors as the moon turned crimson. "Do you regret it?" she asked him. "The covenant? The transformation?" Lysander took her hand, and she felt through their bond the depth of his response before he even spoke the words. "I regret the centuries of believing myself monstrous," he said. "I regret the isolation, the hunger, the certainty of my own damnation. But the covenant? You? This life we're building together? He turned to face her fully. How could I regret the thing that gave me redemption? Evangeline felt the weight of gratitude, of love, of the profound privilege of existing with another consciousness that understood hers completely. I love you, she said, and the words carried centuries of power and promise. I love you, he replied, across every moment of forever. As the blood moon hung full and heavy in the sky, Evangeline felt the stirring of new priestesses waking to their power all across the world. She felt the slow transformation beginning in vampires who had heard of the manor, who were beginning to question the laws of absolute isolation. She felt the threads of the sacred practice being woven back together, one consciousness at a time, one covenant at a time, one moment of integration at a time. The work of restoration had only just begun. But standing there, with Lysander's arm around her waist, and the crimson moonlight shining down on them both, Evangeline understood that they had forever to complete it, that their eternity was not an ending, but a beginning, an infinite stretch of time in which they could help others find what they had found. The darkness that had once been cursed was now understood as sacred. The light that had seemed to demand denial of shadow was now integrated into a whole that contained both, and in the space between them, in the space between mortal and immortal, between hunger and communion, between damnation and redemption, something sacred bloomed. It would bloom, Evangeline knew, for all the centuries to come.